This video is sponsored by EBSCO Industries, Bank of Moundville, Moundville Telephone Company, and Tuscaloosa Tourism and Sports.
My name is Bill Allen, and I am the Collections Manager for Archaeology here at the University of Alabama Museums. And this morning we're going to take a look around the Office of Archaeological Research, the Erskine Ramsay Repository, and get some idea of how archaeology is approached here at the museums. This is the laboratory space here at the Office of Archaeological Research. It's quiet today. Most of our archaeologists are out in the field performing surveys both in the park and out in the state of Alabama. But once they're done with their work there, all the material that they gather and collect comes here for analysis, cataloging, inventory, and curation. When the archaeologists are done with their field work, there's a lot of other work that needs to take place before the artifacts that they bring back can tell us anything about how people lived in the time periods that we're looking at. Artifacts that come in from the field to the lab are washed, cataloged, identified, and then made ready for curation in the archaeological collections of the University of Alabama Museums. The material we study covers the entire history of the human occupation of the state of Alabama, from Native American stone tools and pottery up through 19th century glassware and ceramics recently excavated from an urban site here in the state. Native American projectile points are usually classified by the shape of the proximal end and by the different shapes of the blade themselves and how they were made out of the stone that they were made of. Ceramics can be classified according to surface treatment or by looking at some of the designs and decorations made along the rims of each piece. Historic ceramics follow much the same, where the decorations applied to the surface of the sherd and the different shapes of the glassware allow us to categorize and to date many of the artifacts that we find. Once the artifacts have been analyzed, they're prepared for curation by housing them in archival materials. These are archivally safe bags that won't degrade over time, and everyone is labeled with where it came from, what it is inside, and a number that allows us to enter all the data into the database and then look up and find the things as quickly as possible for future researchers. One of the services that OAR provides for the state is maintenance of the Alabama State Archaeological Site File. In the notebooks that you see in front of you are records of every single reported archaeological site within the state of Alabama. The information is kept both in hard copy and in digital form and is available to qualified archaeologists and researchers throughout the state. We also maintain an extensive research library. Any report done on any site or any collection in the state of Alabama or the University Museum's collections will be preserved here for future archaeologists to use. The research library includes both published and unpublished materials, going back to the beginning of scientific archaeological research in the state of Alabama in the 1800s.
I'm Danielle Schauffeld, and I am the GIS and graphic technician for the Office of Archaeological Research, and I handle pretty much any data that is digital. So GIS is Geographic Information Systems. And what we do is we analyze data spatially. All of the sites are digitized, and I put them into reports. I draw in the new ones when they come. Sometimes if we need to search for a specific site to see if there are patterns. Right now, over on this screen, I've got a bunch of LiDAR processing. This is light imaging, detecting, and ranging. And so what this is making is a digital elevation model of the land around R.L. Harris. And so we'll be able to use that to study the terrain. One of the goals is to find a historic road. That's what I do in a nutshell.
In this room, we're entering the archaeological collections of the University of Alabama Museums. Many of the collections in this room have not yet been brought up to modern standards. There's a number of different collections and different projects, very large ones, that we have yet to work on and rehabilitate. One of the services that the Office of Archaeological Research provides is to provide curatorial services for organizations like the Tennessee Valley Authority, the United States Army Corps of Engineers, or private cultural resource management firms that don't have the facilities needed to maintain and preserve their archaeological collections over time. Some of the projects in this room come from early 1930s and Works Progress Administration surveys that were done by the Tennessee Valley Authority with the Civilian Conservation Corps before the dams along the Tennessee River were built. One of the projects we've been actively involved in the last 5 years is taking all these old collections, rehabilitating them, doing new inventories and analysis of the material, getting them ready for curation in the Erskine Ramsay Archaeological Repository. We are now moving from the Office of Archaeological Research and the Desjarnett Laboratory into the Erskine Ramsay Archaeological Repository. There we go. The Erskine Ramsay Archaeological Repository was originally constructed in 1946. The room we're in right now is our latest addition, which more than doubled the amount of square footage that we had available to store collections. And if the room we were just in could be seen as the before picture, this is the after picture. The material here, like I mentioned before, has all been inventoried, has all been analyzed and recorded, and each piece has been given a number and entered into our database. The material is all stored in these standard curation boxes, each of which amounts to about 1 cubic foot of space. There are over 1,600 of these boxes within the repository. Each box is numbered and labeled with the site that the material came from, meaning that any individual piece should be able to be found. So each of our boxes is numbered sequentially and with the site where the material came from. Each piece in the collection is also given a 3-part accession number. The material in this box, for example, was recovered in 1939. It was the 3rd collection from that year, and piece number 2,330 to 2,339 are in this box. The reason we do this is that if a researcher calls up and asks me for a specific piece, I should be able, with all these numbers in our database, to find anything that they're looking for within 5 to 10 minutes. We not only curate the actual archaeological artifacts, but we curate all the paperwork that comes out of any particular archaeological dig as well, ranging from field notes that the archaeologists take when they're on site to all the laboratory paperwork like we looked at earlier. We have records from the original digs going back to the 1930s and all the way up to the modern day. And this is the original Erskine Ramsay repository, as it was built back in the 1940s. Now, the building is a 2-story building on the outside, but when they renovated back in the 1980s, they decided that they needed more room for storage of archaeological collections like you see here on the shelves. So they put in a mezzanine level, which means that in this part of the building at least, the ceilings are a little bit lower than they could be. I have to be careful every day when I come in not to whack my head on some of the sprinkler pipes or the lighting fixtures. If we come this way though, we can take a look and see just how this facility has changed over time. You go first. This room, which we now use to curate and store our photography collection, used to be the laboratory space for the Office of Archaeological Research, or the Erskine Ramsay Repository, back when it was first built. There was this room about this size, and there was the room across the hall where the sinks and stuff was for washing artifacts. And then there's another room upstairs where people had desks that they could sit down and do their research. If you compare the size of this room to the size of the laboratory where we first started, you'll see just how much more archaeology is being done these days. We took a look earlier at the file storage where all the documentation that we have from the earlier archaeological projects are stored. We also store any images, any photographs that may have been taken. Now that is what we see right here. In these cabinets, we have all sorts of photographs, whether slides, photographic negatives, both modern film and older film, and then storage for modern digital images on archival digital disk. Now, this drawer has all our digital images. These drawers have all our physical images. There are many more images in this drawer than there are in all these drawers put together. Digital imagery allows us to keep much more information, much more visual information than it used to when you had to load the film in your camera and then go get the film processed at your local Kodak and so forth and so on. One of the things that we're seeing more and more in museums these days is open shelving. Portions of the collection that are, while not on exhibit, available to be seen by tours. This is probably what we have in terms of that here at the Erskine Ramsay Repository. We call this our special collections room. The stuff we have in this room is unique in some special way. Stuff that we feel would be appropriate to send out on exhibit for other museums to show and to have at their facilities. I've been getting ready with a couple of replica objects to take the place of the objects that are going out on loan, so there won't be holes in our exhibit here at the Jones Museum. You may recognize the rattlesnake disc, which is the state artifact of Alabama. Well, this is our replica of that. It is a plaster copy that was made by one of the former employees at the museum, and we'll put this in the Jones Museum as a substitute for the disc when the disc goes on its tour around the country. There's also a replica of one of the ceramic vessels from Moundville. This is called the Moundville beaker, and this other piece is also in the museum and will be going out on tour later on this year. Now, there are also some things in this room that we cannot show on camera because of various laws and ethical considerations, chief among them that they are or were funerary objects that are subject to the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. We are working with the tribes to figure out a final disposition of those objects. But until that time, there are some things that we can show you if we wander around and take a look at some of the stuff on the shelves. So a lot of what you'll see if you go to the Jones Museum are ceramic vessels of various types, whether it's the bottles that have the neck on them or the small pots with the handles. Before the Native Americans developed their pottery technology, they would make bowls out of stone. And in here we have two examples of bowls that have been chipped out and carved out of stone. They're not something that was easily transportable, but as a technology before the ceramics took off, this was what you would have. There are actually places in Alabama where you can go and see where they would mine out the bowls, and it looks like you've got a ridge with a bunch of mushroom-shaped bumps where they've started to carve out a bowl but haven't finished. People sometimes ask me what the oldest thing we have in the collection is, and the points that you see here would be my answer to that question. These are called Clovis points, named after Clovis, New Mexico, a small town out in the desert. And if you were carrying one of these around in your pocket, you would be hunting mammoths or trying to protect yourself from saber-toothed tigers. The points you see here are about 15,000 years old and were found here in Alabama. Thank you for joining me on this tour of the Office of Archaeological Research in the Erskine Ramsay Repository, and we hope to see you in the park very, very soon.
To support Moundville Archaeological Park, please consider visiting festival.museums.ua.edu and clicking Support Moundville at the top of the page.